Okay, yeah. It's supposed to be learning. Should be a panacea or for Shleimus or Chiel Nassen and Sarah. Okay, let's start on the New Testament based bottom line. It says Veloy Varishum Sedeshin question mark. They had that in. Okay, what's going on? He said that the blood that was sprinkled or poured on the Beis Hamikdash would get washed down. The remaining of the blood was poured on the base of the Mizbeach, and then it would get washed down in the Amma, and it would go down into the valley. And the gardeners there in the valley would use it as fertilizer. So, but they would have to buy it. They would have to pay for it. So, the Brisa says that there's a machlekes between Reb Meir, Reb Shimon, and the Chacham. Hey, good morning. Is there Me'ila? Me'ila means no. Is there Me'ila in the in the blood? Me'ila means personal use from things that were sanctified. It's a prohibition that incurs there's a carbon that's brought, it's called a shamilas. And you have to pay extra fifth and of the value. And then there's another issue of if it's b'mezid, it's misabedesha. Me'ila is a very serious halacha. The question is the use of the blood that was already sprinkled on the mizbeach, if that incurs me'ila. So we said no. It was a machlekes, but the machlekes is only midrabanan. Midaraisa, everyone holds that there's no me'ila. How do we know that? So we quoted 3 psukim. Ula has a pasuk that says lachem, that you're allowed to use it. Reb Shimon says lachaper, I gave it to you as a kapara, but not for me'ila. And Rabbi Yochanan says who? Okay. In Rabbi Yochanan, when it says who, he learned from it that lifnei kapara is similar to la'achar kapara. Just like la'achar kapara means the atonement. Lifnei kapara, lifnei means before the kapara. Lachem means it is for you, which not that you were allowed to use it, and that there was no meal. But what here we're saying is that just like after kapara, after it's already sprinkled, there's no me'ila. So too, before it's sprinkled, there's also no me'ila. But how do you know that that's the way to learn it? So it says, well, there is nothing after kapara that has me'ila. That was the statement that the Gemara said. So now, today's Gemara starts, there's nothing that the kapara was done. In other words, once the mitzvah is performed with it, it's finished. It's not sanctified anymore. It's already been used. Like a dead battery. I don't know if that's a good example. It's finished. So there's no me'ila. Because why? The blood was sprinkled already. It's finished. The Gemara says there's no me'ila. What about the Chuma Sadeshin? Over there, it says that every morning, the kohen would go up to the first service of the day. The kohen would go up the ramp, take a scoopful of ashes, and put it down on the side of the mizbeach. When it says he put it on the side of the mizbeach, it says the sama yetzel mizbeach, to place it on the side of the mizbeach. And this taught us that it has to be swallowed up. You're not allowed to make any use from it. 1 second, but you did the mitzvah already. What is it telling you? It's telling me that there's an exception here. That there's an exception. Shuma Sadeshen, even after the kapara, even after the mitzvah was performed, there still is me'ila. So the Gemara says, well, we're not going to learn from there to the blood. Why? Mishum Dahavi, we're on top of Daf Sama. Mishum Dahavi, Shuma Sadeshen, a big dekuna, Shneksuv Mabam Kechad, B'chol Shneksuv Mabam Kechad, Ein Malamna. This is a very daring answer, what the Gemara is giving us, because we're about to get into a huge machlekes. The Gemara says that there's a concept called the binyanav. Binyanav means if I find it one place in the Torah, so that could be an example for the rest of the Torah. Call it mamatzino. Um, the only problem with that is that, let's say this, we find it in two places in the Torah. Then we say, oh, now it cannot be an example for the rest of the Torah. Why? Because if it was supposed to be an example for the whole Torah, then why did it have to say it again? Saying it again means that those are exceptions. The extra time it tells me that I can't learn to anywhere else. So what do I have here? I have Truma Sadeshan, where even after the mitzvah is performed, you can't have personal use from it, and if you do, it's Me'ila. It's a prohibition of Me'ila. And then I have the clothing of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, that after he wears them, according to one opinion, there's Me'ila. So you see, you have two examples. You can't learn from there to anywhere else. What's the anywhere else that we're referring to? The blood. The Gemara says, well, you've just entered into a subject that's very controversial, because it says after Yom Kippur, he takes off the clothing that he wore, and he leaves them there. So one opinion says, he leaves them there, means leaves them there means they need to be buried. Can't have any use from it. You're right. Now I have two examples of two things the mitzvah is performed, and there still is Me'ila, Truma Sadeshan, and the clothing. Me'ila is personal use of things that were sanctified. Right? And it's possible for a Kohen to violate Me'ila because he has access to that all the time. But also, if an individual would sanctify something and then use it before he brought it to the Beis Hamikdash, that would also be a prohibition. Kapara means atonement. So there's a machlekes here. What happens with the Kohen Gadol's clothing after Yom Kippur? According to one opinion, they need to be buried. That would mean that there's Me'ila in the clothing, which would mean that now I have two things that have Me'ila, which means that I can't learn from them. Rav Doisa learns it a little different. He says, "V'nicham sham," you place them there, means that the Kohen Gadol cannot wear them again, but a Kohen Hedid can wear them. Now, the Kohen Gadol usually has a different set of clothes that are different than the Kohen Hedid, but on Yom Kippur he puts on white clothing. Now we had a machlekes earlier. Are all the clothing the same? The gartel is the same. Whatever the case is, according to Rav Doisa, he says that a Kohen Hedid is allowed to wear them, those clothing. If the Kohen Hedid is allowed to wear them, then there's obviously no Me'ila. There's no Me'ila. Then there's only one instance of Me'ila after the kapara, after the mitzvah is performed, and that's Truma Sadeshan. We should learn from that to everyone else. According to Rav Doisa, what does it have to say? That should be an example to the rest of the Torah, that there's Me'ila even after the mitzvah is performed. The Gemara answers, Mishum Davi Truma Sadeshan Begla Rufa Shneksav Mabam Kechad. So we take another shot at this. We say that we have Truma Sadeshan, that we know that once the mitzvah, even though the mitzvah is performed, you still can't have benefits from those ashes. What would you have benefits from that? From the ashes? I don't know what you would do with it. You would use it for fertilizer or something. For ink. You could use it in ink. What is it?
Put it on your egg.
Put it on your egg. Oh, for tissue paper. Right. Yeah. They use it in fertilizer. Oh, yeah. I think there was a Gemara somewhere that says that it's going to be used in certain, like, ointments or something for itch. Okay. Here. That's another prohibition. Okay. So, what's our next shot at this? We say Truma Sadeshan and Egla Rufa. Egla Rufa is if a person dies in between cities. So the closer city, the elders of that city come and they break the neck of a calf on that spot in the valley, and you're not supposed to have any benefit from that animal. So even after the mitzvah is performed, see, we have two examples now where the mitzvah is performed and you can't have any benefit from it. So Hani Chalamandam Rain Malamdim, Now we take another approach to questioning this. There's actually a machlokes. If you say that you can't learn from two examples. But there is another opinion that says that you, even though it says it twice in the Torah, you can still learn from the rest of the Torah. The Gemara says, and harufa. It's not just shnei ksuvim abayim kechad. Shnei ksuvim abayim kechad just means that I have two psukim, and each of them teach me the same halacha. Why do I need two? It must be that those should not be learned to anywhere else. Those are exceptions. Or else it would have said one, and then I would have known the second one anyway, because I would have known it through the whole Torah. So, not everyone agrees with that logic. So, what's the other way of doing this? We say like this: that in the word that by Shuma Sadeshan that says that I should place it and not have benefits from it, it says for some might place it. It means that this is only applicable to this mitzvah. And then by the Egla Rufa, it says Ha Arufa. This one. That's a definite article there. So that tells me that it's specifically that. So because of those miyutim, I can't learn from. It's not because I have two of them. It's because each one of them tells me that it's only there. But okay, now the Gemara goes back to what we learned yesterday. We had 3 verses that teach me that there's no me'ilah by blood. V'hani tlasi kroi bedam lamali. Why do I need those 3 verses for? Chad lemutim inoisa. This is an interesting concept. Usually, an animal sacrifice is supposed to be eaten during a certain allotted time. 2 days and 1 night, or 1 day and 1 night. What happens if you eat it after the allotted time, after the expiration date? Yeah, you get some sort of poisoning. It's called the prohibition. The prohibition is nicer. In Yiddish, it's called Ibergeblivena. It's leftover. Now, that applies to the meat. We're learning now that it doesn't apply to the blood. One of those psukim, lachem, tells me that it doesn't apply to the blood. If someone eats leftover blood, so he wasn't allowed to eat blood, there's a prohibition for eating blood. But he doesn't incur the prohibition of eating leftover sacrifice, because that only applies to the sacrifice, not to the blood. There was an exclusion there that says that it is for you, which excludes it from Nisa. Another one is excluding it from Me'ilah. This is a little difficult. I'm not sure how the commentators are going to explain this. We just said I have the answer. Our whole discussion here was after the kapara. We had a whole discussion here. Oh, there can't be me'ilah because we learned there's no me'ilah after the kapara. We learned it from Egla Rufa. We learned it from Shuma Sadesha. Now we're saying there's no me'ilah even before the kapara. Why? Because I have 3 verses that talk about the blood, lachem, lachaper, or who. And that tells me that there's no me'ilah even before the kapara in the blood. Okay. What's the third one? Yeah, if your person has tumah on his body, or that came from his body, he's not allowed to go into the base of Mikdash. He's not allowed to eat the consecrated foods. Let's say he does. So that's a prohibition that has a sacrifice that goes on. It's one of the Asham, right? But let's say he ate blood. So, of course, he violated a prohibition of eating blood, but he didn't violate the prohibition of eating a sacrifice when he's coming. But pigel, remember what pigel is? Pigel is if a person slaughters a sacrifice or sprinkles the blood of a sacrifice with an intention, and he does any of the avodas with an intention of eating or doing one of the avodas of the sacrifice, one of the services of the sacrifice out of the allotted time. Now, even if he doesn't end up doing that, and he does do it in the right time, but because his thoughts were that he was going to do it out of the time, the whole sacrifice becomes invalid, and it's a prohibition. It's pickle if he eats it, because the sacrifice became invalid. So what about if he has these thoughts by if he had the thoughts by one of the services, but he eats the blood of a carbon that's pickle, he's exempt. He was exempt from the prohibition, from the punishment that comes with pickle, which is punishment, is karas, excision. Ditnan, why is that? It was taught in the Mishnah. Kol sheyesh lematir bein la'adam bein lemizbeach chayavan alav misham pickle. V'dam atzmei matir. How does pickle work? Pickle works that I have a matir that allows the rest of the sacrifice to be eaten. What's a matir? Matir means something like a permitter. I sprinkle the blood, you can eat the sacrifice. I offer the scoop of the handful of the flour and oil, I can eat the meal offering. So, but what about the blood itself? What about the scoop itself? Those are the matirim. Those are not what becomes mutter. That's not the recipient. That's the one, the performance itself. So what about the blood itself? So we learn that the blood itself doesn't have the prohibition of pickle. So we're saying that we don't need an extra pasuk for this because this we know from other sources that there's no pickle on the blood itself. Okay. Yeah, Ian's asking when would you eat blood anyway? Dr. Stein mentioned that on the Rabbi Stefanski's Daf Yomi video. So he wanted to show blood. So he pulls out he has a blood in a bowl, he pulls out a big fish, and then he takes like a scoop and eats it. And he says he made it with some recipe he found on Google. But you mix some flour and stuff. It wasn't, he made believe it was coming from a fish. So, why would he eat blood? I think there's two versions and two opinions in a Rashi about that says don't eat blood. One is that people were accustomed to eating blood back then. Idolaters would eat blood. And the other opinion in that Rashi was that you see no one eats blood, and nevertheless you get a mitzvah when you don't eat blood, even though no one eats blood anyway. So Hashem is just giving you an extra mitzvah, an easy mitzvah. Right? Yeah, our discussion here was Yom Kippur. Well, but it would extend to other things also. But they say the Mora gets a note in the mitzvah note. It says, dear Mora, Bela did not bow down to idols last night. Okay. Call the new Mishnah. Call Maisi Yom Kippurim ha'amar ala seder. This is the Mishnah self-referencing. Everything that we've said in the Mishnayos, that there's an order for Yom Kippur, that you do this, and then you do that, and then you do this. So in Hikdim, Maisi lachaver la yasa klam. If you did it out of order, you did nothing, which means it's invalid. The order is very important. Hikdim damasar ledamapar. If the damasar is sprinkled before the blood of the goat is sprinkled before the blood of the cow, the bull, so yachser v'yazim damasar lachadamapar, then you have to go sprinkle the blood of the goat again because it needs to be after. So if you did it before, it's no good. You have to sprinkle again. How do you sprinkle again? Where do you get the blood from again? Well, if you have it in your hand, good. But if you don't have it, you would have to slaughter another animal. We'll see in the Gemara what's the pshat. If the blood's spilt out, so if you're in the middle of a service and the blood spills, you weren't able to complete it. So what you do is you slaughter another animal, and you go back inside and you finish what you're doing. Now, it mentions Yachzer B'tchila Midifnim, means that you have to start over what you were doing. Yeah, it's like when your computer dies and it wasn't saved. To start from you've been there. You have to start over. Start from the beginning of when it was last saved. So over here, you have to start from the beginning. That's right. Yeah, I don't know if there was a shofar in those days. I don't know. The blowing of the shofar after Yom Kippur, I don't know when that began. I'm not sure if it's that. The same thing would happen with the sprinkling of the blood in the Heichal. And the same thing would happen with the sprinkling of the blood on the Mizbeach Hazav. That each one, you would have to, if it's spilt in the middle, you would have to start over from the beginning of that sprinkling. What it's telling me is I don't have to go to previous ones. If it's spilt by the Mizbeach Hazav, that was the last sprinkling of the blood. You don't have to go back and do over in the Kodesh HaKadoshim and do over, which was on the Kapeiros and the lid. And I don't have to go back to the Pareiches. I can just continue from this last one that it got interrupted with.
If you sprinkle one blood before the other, then you have to finish your own?
Yeah.
They didn't remember, but like you mix up two bowls, or you just
then you did them together.
Times, or you could have done one before the other.
So
you didn't count it, but you're still doing it before the other one.
So Dr. Mendel is asking that they pour the blood together, and then I did the sprinkling. That the mitzvah is to do it together. If that's the way to do it, is to sprinkle them together.
We make it when we mix up, when we forgot which one was. When the bowls got mixed up and they didn't know which one it was.
Yeah. If the bowls got mixed up, so we said you have to sprinkle 3 times.
Yeah. So I guess they just didn't count the first.
They just didn't count. Right. What you did doesn't count. So if you do 3 times, then automatically you've covered it.
Right. Yeah, you did it over.
Right. So that's the pshat in Lai Asa Klum. What you did is nothing. It doesn't mean you've invalidated it. It means that if you don't correct it, it's invalid because it's as if it's not there. It's a good point. Rabbi Lezer, Reb Shimon Aimer. Rabbi Lezer is Rabbi Lezer ben Shemua. He's one of the students of Rabbi Akiva. Not as common as the other students. There's 5 students that we talk about always. Reb Meir, Reb Yehuda, Reb Yossi, Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, and then there's Rabbi Lezer ben Shemua. It's not Reb Shimon Bar Yochai's son, Rabbi Lezer ben Shemua. There's Rabbi Lezer ben Shemua. Rabbi Lezer ben Shemua, Rabbi Lezer, Reb Shimon Aimer, Mimakom Shepasuk Mishama Maschel. You don't even have to go back and start over. You can continue. You started. You had to sprinkle 7 times. It's the blood spilt at number 3. So when you come back in, you continue from number 4. Yeah, they're more lenient than the Tanakama. You want to come on, Alicia? Okay. I have an English one. An English. We're on 60A, right after a Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanon. Stored in a brisa, important brisa. Yeah, they get introduced with the Tana Rabbanan. Kol Ma'aseh Yom Kippurim Ha'amar Ala Seder. All of the order of Yom Kippur that we said has to be in order. Yom Hikdim Ma'aseh L'Chaver L'Yoseh Klom. You see, the Mishnah said that as well. But the brisa sometimes elaborates a little bit more. So if you did it out of order, you did nothing. It means it needs to be repeated. Amar Rabbi Yehuda says, this is Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Loi, this is the student of Rabbi Kiva we just mentioned. Masai, when do we say that it needs to be in order, and if you didn't do it, then it's not valid? That's Bidvarim Anasa B'Big Day Lavan Mibifnim. That's only while the Kohen Gadol was wearing his white clothing, and it's the service that he performs inside the Holy of Holies. Aval Dvarim Anasim Big Day Lavan Mibachutz. But if it's a service that's performed, even if it's in the sanctuary, or for sure if it's in the courtyard, then im hiktim ma'isa lachavera, if you do something out of order, mashal sasi, it's valid. It's valid. The order doesn't matter. It's only the things that are in the sanctuary. Where do we get this from? We'll see in a minute. There's a pasuk that they use, but the pasuk uses the word chukah, the statute. Statute tells me that if it's done not correctly, it's invalid. Question is, what is that pasuk referring to? Rabbi Yehuda says that pasuk is referring to the services that were performed inside the not just the sanctuary, but inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But outside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, then it's valid if it's out of order. Yeah, Reb Nechemia Aimer, Reb Nechemia says, "B'med dvarim amorim b'dvarim anasim bigdi lavan bein b'mipnim bein b'machutz." Reb Nechemia is a little more strict. He says, if you're wearing the white, if the Kohen Gadol is wearing the white clothing, I don't care where it is, inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim or in the sanctuary, any service that's done with the white clothing, which means it's special Yom Kippur service, then it's invalid if it's out of order. So if he's wearing the gold clothes, then it's not a problem. The golden clothes was worn, those are the regular Kohen Gadol clothes, that was worn just for the Karban Tamid in the morning. It wasn't a specific Yom Kippur service. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. And also, I'm sorry, there was a specific Yom Kippur service. There was a ram that was not brought into the sanctuary. That was done in the golden clothing. 2 rams actually. Okay. So we have 2 opinions here. The opinion of Rabbi Yehuda and the opinion of Rabbi Nechemia. And the machlekes is if the order invalidates the service for services that are not in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rabbi Yehuda says it does not. It's acceptable if the order is switched. And Rabbi Nechemia says no, it's invalid. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia are very common to argue in the Medrash. The whole Medrash Bereshis is all machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Who the tribes married, their sisters are Canaanite women. That's machlekes Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia. Very common in the Medrash. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemia argue. In the Gemara, it's like Rabbi Yehuda usually argues with others. But okay, here we have it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was already an Amoira in Eretz Yisrael. He discusses what was going on in this machlekes. He says, "Ushnei mikrei chadarsha." They both learned it from the same verse. It says, "V'haisa zayis lachem l'chukas olam achas b'shana," and this is the statute for you, for them, once a year. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Rabbi Yehuda holds Makim Shemiskaprim by Pamachas B'Shana. Notice that once a year. What is the once a year referring to? This is a statute that's referring to that there's one place a year that you use that over there, if it's not done according to the statute, then it's invalid. Rabbi Nechemia Savar Dvarim HaMeskaprim Ben Pamachas B'Shana. No, it's not the location that changes it. There are things that are used only once a year. And what are those things? The clothing that's used only once a year by the Kohen Gadol. That's where the statute applies. So when we said that there's a special thing once a year, what is that special thing that's once a year? Is it the location that's used once a year? Or is it the clothing that's used once? If it's the clothing, then it's more inclusive, which would exclude more items if they're out of order. So that's Rabbi Nechemia's opinion. The Gemara says, "Atul Rabbi Yehuda makim ksiv." What's going on? It says the location. It doesn't say a location. Where did he get that from? He's making it all dependent on the location. Elahaina time of the Rabbi Yehuda, the reason is ksiv zais, ksiv achas. It says, this is the statute. So I know that it's not referring to anything else. It's zais is limiting. It's restricting it to only one item. So what is that item? So it says zais, and it also says one. So chadamuti bigdei lavan mibachutz, chadamuti bigdei zav. Those two words are exclusions. One is excluding if he's wearing the golden clothing. That's not going to go into this category of chukah or the statute. And the other one is that if he's outside of the sanctuary, out more than the sanctuary, if he's outside of the Kodesh Kodashim, even if he's in the sanctuary, then the order is not marked. It has to be in the sanctuary itself, even if he's wearing the white clothes. Oh, not in the sanctuary, in the Kodesh Kodashim itself, the Holy of Holies. Rav Nechemia, what does Rav Nechemia learn? He says, Chadamuti bigdei zav, Chadamuti shirayim b'lei makne. Rav Nechemia says no. Nechemia says that the word chukah is referring to two things as well, because it's excluded from two things as well, because it says zais and it says achas. But you know what those two things are? One is bigdei zav, he's wearing the golden clothing. And the other one is that if he doesn't end up, there was a remainder of the blood, if he doesn't end up spilling that out in the right order. Yeah, I wouldn't have understood that it means in the right order, but Rashi writes that it means in the right. I would have thought that it meant if he doesn't end up spilling it out in the right place, or it just ends up spilling, that it would be acceptable. But Rashi doesn't say that.
I guess this explains why the discussion about whether there are one or two sticks that the cups of blood were put on is important. Because when he goes into Kodesh Kadoshim, he's only going in with one cup.
Right.
But, I kept wondering, why is this important? Why they talk? Remember the whole controversy about one or two sticks?
Right.
And this is why it's important. Because he gets it wrong.
The order. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So now Rab Nechemia introduces that it's actually excluding one more item. When we say excluding one more item, that means that there's going to be a leniency about this, because the word chukah, the statute, is not applicable to this item. Which item are we referring to? The remaining blood, if it's done out of order, if it's spilled out of order, it's supposed to be spilled on the corner, on the on the southern side of the Mizbeach. I think that's what Naftali you taught. That it's spilled on the Shimon, it's machlekes over there. But so Nechemia says it doesn't matter if it's done out of order. What does Rabbi Yehuda say to that? You see, Rabbi Yehuda, he's just presenting his own system here. Rabbi Yehuda said that the order is very important for anything that's in the Holy of Holies. But if it's out of the Holy of Holies, either because it's wearing golden clothing or it's just in even white clothing, but it's just in the sanctuary, so the order is not ma'akev, doesn't invalidate it. It's done out of order. But Nechemia says that there's two things, you're right, but those two things are if he's wearing golden clothing, and if the remaining of the blood is not done in order, the spilling of the remaining blood is not done in order, which means that Reb Nechemia doesn't agree with Rabbi Yehuda regarding if he's wearing white clothing. Rabbi Yehuda said white clothing didn't matter, it was still valid, and Reb Nechemia holds it's invalid. Any service that's done in white clothing out of order is invalid, and Rabbi Yehuda wouldn't hold of Reb Nechemia. He would hold that the remaining blood is ma'akev. That's a little bit of a problem here, because where's the remaining blood poured? Outside of the Holy of Holies.
If Rabbi Yehuda said that he could say it's the Kodesh was important, right?
Right.
Is there a time when the candidate would wear gold clothing inside the congregation?
No.
Why would he just do that if he's still in the congregation?
Okay. Yeah. I'm stumped. Nothing to ask the question, but I think I have the answer. You see, we're presenting this wrong. We're presenting this that it's the Kodesh HaKadoshim that's the main thing. Then we ask the question, does it say Kodesh HaKadoshim? Does it say the location? Doesn't say the location. We got to it in a roundabout manner. We got to it because it needs to be the white clothing. It needs to be, it's only things that are not in the gold clothing. It's also things that are not just in the white clothing. It has to be in the location as well. So it wasn't, I figured out at the end of it, my result is the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but my process was first not things that are in the gold clothing, and then not even in the white clothing, which location, and then in the end, my result is the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Menachem Mendel was asking if you never wear gold clothing in the Kodesh HaKadoshim anyway. So once it says that it's not in the gold clothing, why do you have to tell me in the Kodesh HaKadoshim? It's automatically. Once it says the Kodesh HaKadoshim, automatically it doesn't apply to the gold clothing. But it's working backwards. And in the end, our result is that. Okay. Now the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yehuda, what does Rabbi Yehuda say about the shirayim? Shirayim is the leftovers, right? The leftovers by a Hasidic tish, not in Chabad, but the Rebbe would eat a little bit, and then what he leaves over. What's that called? Called shirayim. So shirayim is the leftovers. Get that to heaven. All the Hasidim gets passed out. Yeah, there was a Rebbe, Repenach of Alexander. Was very funny. He said this argument: what's stronger, covet, honor, or desire for Taiva? So he says, "I'll prove it to you that honor is stronger." They have the plate of food in front of me. He said, "Because Taiva tells me that I should finish the whole plate, but covet tells me I should leave a little bit over for." So see, I'm going to leave it. The covet is stronger than time. Okay. So Rabbi Yehuda's opinion about shirayim goes like this. He says, Rabbi Yehuda, ima akvi ma'akvi. It depends what we're talking about. If this was a sacrifice that the blood was brought inside, Kodesh HaKadoshim, then this is a sacrifice that the order matters about. And therefore, the shirayim will also be invalid if they're out of order. If this is a type of sacrifice that was not brought inside, and therefore the general sacrifice, the order didn't matter for, then then the shirayim doesn't matter. Shirayim only matters for sacrifices that the order mattered for. Okay. Kiddatanyas was taught in a brisa. It says regarding Yom Kippur, V'chila michaper as hakodesh, and he will conclude from atoning in the holies. Im kippur, kila. If he atones, then he's concluded. Im like kippur, like kila. And if he doesn't atone, then it's not concluded. Divri Rabbi Akiva. Yeah. When we finish this brisa, we'll go back. We'll explain what's going on. We'll see in a moment. Let's bear with me. It says, Amalei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is a student of Rabbi Akiva. He says to his teacher, Rabbi Akiva, he says, im kila keeper. Why don't you say it differently? If you conclude, then you've atoned. If you don't conclude the whole service, keeper, then you haven't atoned, which would mean, why don't you say it like that? Okay, so we have a machlekes here between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda what's the way to study this verse? One says that if you've done the atonement, which means the application of blood, then you've concluded the service. The other one says, if you've concluded the service, then you've done the atonement. And what's the difference? So, if I'm reading my Bina, what's the difference between those two versions? Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shua ben Levi. Chadam mashmas darshanik Bina. One of them says there's actually no difference. They both mean the same thing. He just understood it that once you've done the atonement, then you've concluded. Another one said once you've concluded, then you've received atonement. But they're saying the same point. The other one says Shirayim Akvi Akabinayo. There's a machlokes about Shirayim. Now, if you go back to look at this, what Rabbi Akiva is saying, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying, it's very interesting. Rabbi Akiva said, Im Kiper Kila. If you did the atonement, that means you did the application of blood, you've concluded the service. Forget about the Shirayim being poured on the outside. You've already concluded. What's left over, what do you do with the remaining that needs to be poured outside? That is not ma'akev anymore. Im kiper means the ikar kapara, which is the application of blood, kila. Then you're done. Comes along Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Kila, if you've done everything, if you've concluded even the shirayim, then then you receive the atonement. So Rabbi Yehuda has a strict opinion regarding shirayim, which says that actually shirayim is ma'akev. Reb Nechemya told me that I have a word zois and I have a word achas. One of them excludes the golden clothing from being ma'akev, that it doesn't matter, it doesn't invalidate if it's out of order. And the other one says that the shirayim doesn't invalidate, the leftovers doesn't invalidate. That was Reb Nechemya's view. But Rabbi Yehuda's view is that shirayim and certain things is ma'akev. Depends. If it went inside, then that's ma'akev. Even the blood, the remaining blood is ma'akev. The Gemara now says, Miyom Rabbi Yochanan, Achi. We're going back to the interpretation of. This gets confusing. We just had two Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Shua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan, but we're not referring to that one. Rabbi Shua ben Levi and Rabbi Yochanan are discussing what the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Akiva is. Is there a machlokes there at all, or is there a machlokes about shirayim? That's machlokes Rabbi Shua ben Levi and Rabbi machlokes. There's machlokes. But now we're going back to the Rabbi Yochanan earlier that discussed the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemya is based on how they learn the pasuk. Where Rabbi Yochanan explained that they're learning that there's two exclusions here, and they're arguing about what the second exclusion is. Everyone agrees that the golden clothing is not ma'akev if it's out of order. Any service performed in the golden clothing. The question is the second one, what's that exclude? So Rabbi Yochanan explained that in Reb Nechemya, it's excluding shirayim. That shirayim is not ma'akev, the remaining blood. The Gemara says, Miyam Rabbi Yochanan Achi. Did Rabbi Yochanan really say this? Rabbi Yochanan, we have another statement from Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was in Eretz Yisrael, lived in Tveria, but the Talmud Bavli is loaded with statements of Rabbi Yochanan. Really, like everywhere is Rabbi Yochanan. Not every page, but I would say every 5 pages. Okay, that's out of 2,711 pages. It's a lot of time. So yeah, 400 times or something. So Tana, it says Reb Nechemya kedibri yoyim shirayim makvi. What's a brisa? Reb Nechemya holds that shirayim is ma'akev. It's exactly the opposite of the opinion that was quoted here. How could you say Rabbi Yochanan says that Reb Nechemya holds shirayim isn't ma'akev? We have a brisa where Rabbi Yochanan himself is quoting, saying that Rabbi Nechemia holds Shirayim is mad. Gemara says, well, that's the case. Kasha. Leave it as a question. Yeah, we did leave this unresolved. Amar Rab Chanina. Rab Chanina says, let's go back, discuss the order over here. The par is the bull, that was shechted first. However, there was a fellow, a kohen, that was stirring the blood of the par while the keteris was being offered inside. He was stirring it to make sure it doesn't congeal, because if you leave the blood, it would congeal. So how was the keteris done? He took a fire pan in one hand, and he took a spoon of keteris in the other hand, and then he had to flip it over, get it into his hands possibly, and flip it over into the fire pan once he's in the keteris HaKadoshim. Then he went back out, and he took... It says, anyone remember what the spoon was made out of? I think it was gold. The fire pan was for sure gold on Yom Kippur. Remember, usually it was silver. Here it was gold. They used only one fire pan. Anyway, then he went back. He got the blood from the fellow that was stirring it, the kohen, and then he went inside and he sprinkled it. So here it says, Rabbi Chanina says, let's say the keteris was scooped before the par was slaughtered, before the bull was slaughtered. That's out of order. So you did nothing. I think it means he offered the keteris. It doesn't just mean scooped. I think it means he took it into the keteris HaKadoshim. Come on, where does this go like? That the order matters. Well, the keteris goes inside. The par goes inside. It says the like Rabbi Yehuda. Doesn't fit with Rabbi Yehuda. Why? The Gemara is thinking like this. I know the par goes inside, but the shechita of the par is not inside. The shechita of the par is not in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. The shechita of the par is in the courtyard, on the tzafin between the mizbeach and the ulam. Remember, so the like Rabbi Yehuda can't put Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said that the only thing that's ma'akiv are things that are in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Rabbi Yehuda, Amar ki ksiva chuka b'dvar manasim b'gdilavim mibifnim u'deksiva. It's only written, the word chuka, the statute, is only for things that are in the Kodesh HaKadoshim itself. Where it says, afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda. It's not so. This could even fit, Rabbi Chanina's statement could even fit with Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Chanina usually is the first generation Amayr, Rabbi Chanina Bar Chama. This could even fit with Rabbi Yehuda, who was earlier, Tana. Why? We're extending Rabbi Yehuda's view now. It's not just things that are actually in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, but anything that's associated with the Kodesh HaKadoshim. In other words, that sacrifice actually goes inside. The shechita of an animal, that the blood is going to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the order of that shechita is also ma'akid. Yeah, so we've extended. We thought Rabbi Yehuda was so exclusive. It turns out that it's more inclusive. I don't know if it's more than Rabbi Nechemia, not more than Rabbi Nechemia, but it will include also even services that are outside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, as long as it's for something that will later be in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Tanan was taught in the Mishnah, in our Mishnah. In the Mishnah, we learned that if the blood spilled out, you're in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and the blood spilled, so you have to go and get new blood, and then you sprinkle it again. Now remember, the animal was shechted, the keteris was brought, then you do the blood. When you're going to shecht an animal again, you need to bring the keteris again. Otherwise, you brought keteris before the shechita. So the keteris would also need to be redone. The Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah says, if you didn't finish the matanis and the blood spilled, so you go bring other blood and you sprinkle. How could you sprinkle? There's the keteris that comes after the shechita. V'misa, if you're correct in what you're saying in your answer, that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, the shechita has to be in order, according to Rabbi Chanina. So yachser v'yachban mibayile, it shouldn't say that you go and sprinkle again. It should say you go and you do ketairos again. When it says ketairos like kamayri, you're right. You have to do the ketairos again, but that wasn't our discussion. Our discussion was the sprinkling. So yeah, you shech the animal, you do the ketairos, but the point was you have to do the sprinkling again. Amar Ula. Sar sheshachta yikoydematan dami shel-par. You see, after he sprinkled the blood of the bull, he then went and shechted the goat. Let's say he shechted the goat before he applied the blood of the bull, before he sprinkled it inside. So he didn't do anything. Okay. Tanan hikten damasel damapar yachsav yazmi damasar acher damapar. The Mishnah said that if you sprinkle the blood of the goat before the par, then you have to sprinkle again the goat after the par, right? Remember, you can correct it by doing it later. And if it's correct that the shechita needs to be in order as well, yachzer v'yishchait mi bayilei. We're thinking over here that the goat was shechted before the par, and that's why you sprinkled it first. That would mean that you can't just sprinkle again. You have to go and shecht again. So tigmu'ula b'matanis shebehechol. We're not talking about that it's the original sprinkling where you only had the goat shechted and not the bull shechted. We're talking about that you already shechted everything in order. You shechted the par, and then you did the ketores, and then you sprinkled the dama par, and then you shechted the goat, and then you brought that into the pnim as well. Now you're in the heichal. And in the heichal, you sprinkled the sar, because you confused it, remember? Yeah, we had that case. You sprinkled the blood of the goat before the par. So in that case, we'll say that you have to do the goat afterwards again. But not that you have to shecht again, because the shechita was done in order. Okay, let's leave it over here. Shekayach. Okay.